a home in the desert, worth nearly $1 million, with a spectacular view of the mountains, and a tap that delivers nothing. No water. Not a drop. This isn't a scene from a dystopian movie. This was the reality for hundreds of families in the Rio Verde foothills, just outside Phoenix, on January 1st, 2023. They had built their lives on a legal loophole, a promise of water that was never guaranteed. And then, one day, the promise expired. The water stopped. At the exact same time, the city they lived next to, Phoenix, Arizona, was being celebrated as the fastest growing major metropolitan area in the entire United States. A magnet for people, for industry, for growth. 5 million residents and counting, all packed into the heart of the Sonoran Desert during the worst megadrought the region has seen in 1,200 years. How do you reconcile those two images? A city booming while its own backyard runs dry. A place so thirsty for new residents, it seems to have forgotten that people need to drink. What would you do if your tap went dry tomorrow? What's the first thing you'd do? Let us know in the comments below. That contradiction is not an accident. It is a crisis built over decades. And now, the math is in. The state of Arizona's own scientists have run the models, and the number they found is staggering. 4.86 million acre-feet. That is the projected shortfall. That is the amount of groundwater that has been promised to new homes that physically does not exist in the earth beneath Phoenix. Not a possibility. A certainty. A debt of nearly 5 million acre-feet of water has already been written against an account that is empty. So the state did the only logical thing. It pulled the emergency brake. It stopped issuing building permits for developments that relied on this phantom water. And then, something unbelievable happened. The builders sued, and in 2026, they won. A judge ruled that the state of Arizona had no right to stop them, that the unstoppable engine of growth could legally roar back to life, whether the water was there or not. So the real question is not whether Phoenix will run out of water. The state's own data says it will. The question is, why is nobody allowed to stop it? A lot of people watch our documentaries and get so deep into the story they forget to subscribe. We have a very low subscription rate because of it. If you want to understand the hidden forces shaping your world, take 1 second right now and hit that button. It's the single best way to make sure you don't miss what we uncover next. It is an emergency for us. Now, let's begin. To understand how a city can knowingly build itself into a water deficit, you have to go back to 1980. Arizona was facing a crisis. Decades of unchecked groundwater pumping by farms and cities were draining the state's aquifers at an alarming rate. The ground was literally sinking. Fissures were cracking open the desert floor. It was an existential threat, and for once, the politicians acted. They passed something called the Groundwater Management Act, or GMA. At the time, it was seen as one of the most progressive, forward-thinking water laws in the history of the United States. Its central pillar was a simple, powerful idea. Before a developer could build a single home in a major urban area like Phoenix, they had to prove they had an assured water supply for the next 100 years. A 100-year guarantee. It was the bedrock of Arizona's growth model. It gave banks the confidence to lend, builders the confidence to build, and buyers the confidence to move to a desert, certain that the water would always be there. It was a promise written into law. It should have saved them, but the law had a feature, or a flaw, depending on who you ask. What if you were a developer and you didn't have access to a river? What if the land you wanted to build on was miles from a canal, sitting on top of an ancient aquifer? The GMA had an answer for that. You could still pump the groundwater. You just had to replace it. In 1993, the state created an entity to manage this equation, the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, or CAGRD. The concept was ingenious, almost like a financial instrument. A developer could enroll their subdivision in the CAGRD. They would pay a fee, and in exchange, they could pump groundwater to serve their new homes. The CAGRD would then take that money, buy water from another source, almost always the Colorado River, and put it back into the ground somewhere else in the region, replenishing the aquifer. On paper, the balance sheet was perfect. Water out, water in. The aquifer, in theory, remained whole. Developers called this paper water. It was a credit, a legal right to pump, backed by the promise that the debt would be settled elsewhere, by someone else. For 30 years, this system fueled an explosion of growth across the Phoenix suburbs. Master-planned communities bloomed in the desert, built on land that had no direct connection to a river, all of them running on the legal fiction of paper water. The problem is that a spreadsheet is not a watershed. Sarah Porter, the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, has pointed out the fundamental flaw in this system for years. One concern, she explains, is that where that water is being replenished is not the place where it is being taken out. It's a geographical mismatch with devastating consequences. You might pump groundwater in the fast-growing western suburbs, near a town called Buckeye, and the CAGRD might replenish that water 50 miles away, closer to the city's core. The numbers on the spreadsheet balance. The aquifer as a regional whole looks fine, but locally, where the pumping is happening, the water table is still dropping. The aquifer is being hollowed out from a single point. This creates cones of depression. It can cause the land itself to compact and sink, a condition called subsidence. Aquifers damaged by subsidence lose their ability to store water forever. You aren't just taking water out, you're breaking the container it was stored in. And then there was the second, even bigger problem. The entire replenishment scheme, the entire premise of paper water was backed by a single source, the Colorado River. The same river that fills Lake Mead. The same river that supplies 40 million people across 7 states. The same river that, by the early 2000s, was already beginning to fail. The 1922 compact that divided the river's water was based on data from one of the wettest periods in the last millennium. The architects of that agreement promised more water than the river actually carries. For a century, the states have been drawing from a bank account that was never as full as the opening statement claimed. As the megadrought took hold, as the bathtub ring around Lake Mead grew wider and more visible each year, the water that was supposed to back up Arizona's paper promises started to vanish. The CAGRD was trying to buy water on the open market that was becoming scarcer, more expensive, and less reliable with every passing season. The foundation of Arizona's growth machine was cracking. The state's top water managers knew they were heading for a wall. They just didn't know how close it was. The reckoning came in the form of a computer model. For years, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, or ADWR, led by Director Tom Bushatsky, had been working to build a complete, state-of-the-art hydrological model of the groundwater basins beneath the Phoenix metro area. They fed it decades of data, pumping rates, rainfall patterns, geological surveys, and projected population growth. The goal was to finally see, with scientific certainty, if the 100-year assured water supply promise was still mathematically sound. In January 2023, the first results came out. It was for a region on the far western edge of the metro, the lower Hassayampa sub-basin. This was prime real estate, the next frontier for massive master-planned communities. The model's conclusion was brutal. A projected 4.4 million acre-foot shortfall over the next 100 years. The water that developers were planning to build on simply wasn't there. Then, on June 1st, 2023, the big one dropped. The ADWR, alongside Arizona's new governor, Katie Hobbs, unveiled the results for the entire Phoenix active management area. The number was 4.86 million acre-feet. 4.86 million acre-feet. It's a number so large it becomes abstract. So let's make it concrete. 1 acre-foot of water is 325,851 gallons. It's enough to supply about 3 typical Arizona homes for an entire year. So a shortfall of 4.86 million acre-feet is enough water for nearly 15 million homes for a year. It's more water than the entire state of Arizona is legally allowed to take from the Colorado River in a year and a half. This was the debt that had been allowed to accumulate. It was the bill for decades of magical thinking, finally coming due. Governor Hobbs stood at a podium and made the announcement. She was unsealing the study, making the grim reality public. The results of this study show that we need to take action once again, she said. If we do nothing, we could face a 4% shortfall in groundwater supplies over the next 100 years. A 4% shortfall. The number sounds deceptively small, manageable. But it represented nearly 5 million acre-feet of water that had been promised to people, written into zoning plans, and factored into the bottom line of the state's most powerful industry, yet did not exist. The same day, the ADWR announced it was hitting the brakes. It would immediately pause the issuance of new certificates of assured water supply for any proposed subdivision that relied solely on pumping groundwater. For the first time since 1980, the state of Arizona admitted that the promise it had built its entire modern identity on was broken. The unstoppable growth machine had finally met an immovable object, geological reality. It seemed like a turning point, a moment of necessary, painful honesty. It lasted less than a year. The response from the real estate industry was immediate and ferocious. This wasn't a water crisis to them. It was an economic catastrophe. Spencer Camps, a vice president for the Homebuilders Association of Central Arizona, or HBACA, became the industry's leading voice. He argued the state's models were an overreaction. That 4% shortfall over a century was a manageable problem, not a reason to shut down the state's economy. The pause on development, they argued, was choking the supply of new housing precisely when Phoenix needed it most, sending home prices skyrocketing and killing the Arizona dream for thousands of families. They didn't just complain. They hired lawyers. The HBACA, represented by attorney Andrew Gould from the powerhouse conservative firm the Goldwater Institute, filed a lawsuit against the ADWR. Their argument wasn't about hydrology. It was about power. They claimed that Tom Bushatsky and the ADWR had illegally bypassed the state legislature, that a regulatory agency couldn't just invent new rules that had the force of law. That pausing development amounted to a water tax on new homebuyers, imposed without a single vote from elected officials. The case landed in the courtroom of Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Scott Blaney. The state argued its case based on science. The models were clear. The water wasn't there. Their mandate under the 1980 Groundwater Management Act was to ensure a 100-year supply, and they could no longer do that. The builders argued based on procedure. The law is the law. The ADWR had overstepped its authority. On April 21, 2026, Judge Blaney issued his ruling. He sided with the homebuilders. He ruled that the ADWR's 2023 moratorium was an illegal overreach of executive power. The agency had created a substantive new rule without going through the proper administrative process. The decision was a stunning blow to the Hobbs administration. The pause on development was lifted. The door was open again for subdivisions to be approved, even if they relied on the same overdrafted groundwater basins. But the ADWR had a backup plan. They had proposed a new rule, what they called the 25% haircut plus conservation. It required developers who wanted to use groundwater to not just replace what they pumped, but to replace it, and then some, securing 125% of their projected water use from renewable sources. It was an attempt to start paying down the aquifer's debt. The builders sued again, and on June 9th, 2026, Judge Blaney struck that down too. He was even more direct this time. He called the 125% requirement an unlawful water tax. Andrew Gould, the builder's attorney, celebrated the victory. At the end of the day, he said, was forcing, ultimately, homebuyers to subsidize groundwater for other uses, and it was impacting housing and affordability. In the span of 2 months, the state's entire strategy to confront the groundwater crisis had been dismantled by the courts. Not because the science was wrong. The judge never ruled on the validity of the 4.86 million acre-foot shortfall. He ruled that the regulators trying to fix the problem had done it the wrong way. And so, Phoenix entered a strange and dangerous limbo. The state's own scientists were screaming that the deep aquifers were running out, but the state's legal system had just declared it illegal to stop drilling new straws into them. The growth machine was back on, and it was now running on faith. This is a battle between scientific models and economic growth, happening at a scale that is hard to comprehend. If you think this is a story that more people desperately need to understand, hit the like button. And if you have family or friends who think of Phoenix as just a boomtown, share this with them. It helps get this crucial information out there, because what's happening in Arizona is a preview for cities across the world. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. Because the narrative of evil developers paving over a fragile desert is not entirely true. In fact, in one of the great ironies of the water crisis, building a sprawling suburban neighborhood can actually save water. It sounds impossible. It is not. The key is what was there before the houses. For a century, central Arizona was a powerhouse of industrial agriculture. Vast fields of cotton, citrus, and especially alfalfa, a notoriously thirsty crop used for cattle feed. These farms relied on flood irrigation, an ancient and wildly inefficient technique where massive amounts of water are diverted from canals and simply flooded across fields. Much of it evaporates under the desert's sun or soaks past the root zone, lost forever. When a developer buys one of these farms, the first thing they do is turn off the water. The alfalfa dies. The flood irrigation stops. They then pave over the land and build hundreds of single-family homes, each with low-flow toilets, efficient dishwashers, and maybe a small patch of desert, friendly landscaping. The math is shocking. According to the state's own Ag-to-Urban Water Credit Program, the transition from high-intensity agriculture to modern residential use can reduce total water consumption on that same plot of land by up to 80%. That single fact complicates everything. It means that, in a purely mathematical sense, continued growth can be a tool for conservation. It reframes the debate from growth versus no growth to what kind of growth the state wants to encourage, and it highlights an even greater hypocrisy buried in Arizona's water laws. While the state was cracking down on new housing in Phoenix, imposing moratoriums and demanding developers prove a 100-year supply, there are vast stretches of rural Arizona where no such rules exist. None at all. In these areas, if you can buy land, you can drill a well and pump as much groundwater as you want, for free. For years, this loophole allowed a Saudi Arabian agricultural company named Fondomonte to lease state land in rural La Paz County, pump unlimited, free groundwater, and use it to grow water-guzzling alfalfa. That alfalfa was then shipped back to the Middle East to feed dairy cows. Governor Hobbs eventually terminated their state leases, but the practice continues on private land with other entities. Think about that. The state told a family they couldn't build a home in a Phoenix suburb because the water wasn't there. At the same time, a foreign corporation was pumping that same state's finite groundwater to grow food for another continent with no restrictions. This leads to the most important distinction in this entire story. There are, in effect, two Phoenixes. There is the city of Phoenix itself, the urban core, and it is a global model of water conservation. Despite its explosive population growth, the city as a whole uses less water today than it did 20 years ago. Its per capita consumption has plummeted by over 30%. The city government is ruthless in its efficiency. Look at the numbers. The city of Phoenix gets almost none of its water from the ground. About 60% of its supply comes from the Salt and Verde rivers, managed by the Salt River Project, a utility that has operated the region's network of dams and canals for over a century. The other 40% comes from the beleaguered Colorado River, delivered via the 336-mile-long Central Arizona Project Canal. Groundwater accounts for only 2% of the city's portfolio, and what happens to water after it's used is even more remarkable. Phoenix treats and reclaims 100% of its wastewater. Every drop that goes down a drain is cleaned to near pristine quality and put back to work. Some of it is used to irrigate parks and golf courses. Some is used to recharge the aquifer, but in a very deliberate, managed way. And some of it is piped 35 miles west into the desert to do a job no one would ever expect. It cools the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, the largest power plant of any kind in the United States. It's the only nuclear plant on the planet that is not located near a large body of natural water. Its cooling towers run entirely on the treated wastewater from the toilets and sinks of 5 million people. It is a closed-loop marvel of industrial symbiosis. That is the first Phoenix, a dense, efficient, technologically advanced city that has engineered its way to a sustainable water future. But then there is the second Phoenix, the sprawling, ever-expanding periphery, the unincorporated communities and new suburban towns built on what was once empty desert or farmland. This is the Phoenix that runs on paper water. This is the Phoenix that depends on deep groundwater. This is where the 4.86 million acre-foot shortfall is located. This is the Phoenix in crisis. And if you want to see the human cost of that crisis, you have to go back to the Rio Verde foothills. The people who bought homes there weren't stupid. They were told the water arrangement was normal. For years, the community relied on water haulers. Trucks would fill up their tanks at a standpipe in the nearby city of Scottsdale, drive out to the foothills, and pump water into each home's private storage tank. It was clunky, but it worked. The residents were living in unincorporated Maricopa County, which allowed them to bypass the 100-year assured water supply rule that applied to incorporated cities. It was the original loophole. But the water they were buying was Scottsdale's water, from Scottsdale's Colorado River allocation. As the river dried up and federal cuts were imposed, Scottsdale announced it had to prioritize its own citizens. On January 1st, 2023, it turned off the standpipe. The crisis was immediate. The community of 500 homes was cut off. Water haulers had to drive much farther to find new sources, and the cost to residents skyrocketed overnight. People were paying hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars a month for the most basic necessity of life. They were taking Navy showers, flushing toilets once a day, letting their landscaping die. Some were considering abandoning their homes. They had become the nation's poster child for a water crisis that, for most Americans, was still an abstraction. Former Phoenix Mayor Terry Goddard looked at situations like Rio Verde and had a stark warning. You're living on borrowed water. For 3 years, the residents of Rio Verde fought. They pleaded with the county, with the state, with private utilities. They were trapped. They didn't have the legal status of a city, so they couldn't sign water contracts. They were a community of individuals, suddenly responsible for building an infrastructure solution that normally takes decades of government planning. Finally, a private utility named EPCOR-USA stepped in. They agreed to finance and build a permanent water filling station specifically for the community. On January 1st, 2026, 3 years to the day after their water was cut off, the station officially opened. The crisis was over. But the lesson was burned into the landscape. Rio Verde was a warning. It was the canary in the coal mine, demonstrating what happens when you build on a promise instead of a pipe. And now, thanks to the 2026 court rulings, the state of Arizona is allowing thousands of new homes to be built on that exact same promise, hoping for a different result. I know we mentioned it before, and maybe this is the second or third time, but it's really important. If you've made it this far into the story, you're clearly one of the curious ones who wants to understand how the world really works. We are a tiny team, and every single subscription tells the algorithm that these deep documentaries matter. It only takes you one click, but it makes a massive difference for us. Please, if you haven't already, take a moment and subscribe. The current legal landscape in Arizona is one of profound, almost surreal contradiction. The physics of the situation are undeniable. The geology is unforgiving. The math of the 4.86 million acre-foot deficit has not changed, yet the law, as it currently stands, has sided with the economy. The Governor's Water Policy Council is now scrambling to find a legislative solution, a new law that can pass the State House and withstand a legal challenge, one that can reconcile the demands of growth with the reality of scarcity. But the political will is fractured. The homebuilding lobby is one of the most powerful forces in the state, and the memory of Judge Blaney's rulings is fresh. Any new law will have to be a compromise. It might involve more aggressive water conservation measures, new funding for large-scale reuse and desalination projects, or perhaps a revised version of the ag-to-urban credit system that incentivizes developers to retire farmland and its massive water rights permanently. But all of that takes time. Time to draft bills, time to negotiate, time to build new infrastructure. And time is measured differently when you're talking about hydrology. Underneath the West Valley, where bulldozers are already clearing ground for the next wave of master-planned communities, the water table continues its slow, silent retreat. The deficit continues to grow. Each new home built on that land is another promise made against an account that is already overdrawn. Phoenix is not a cautionary tale. Not yet. It is something more complex. It's a laboratory for the future of urban life in an era of climate change. It is a city that holds two opposing truths at the same time. The truth of incredible ingenuity, efficiency, and adaptation, and the truth of reckless, unsustainable, and legally protected gambling. One part of the city is recycling its way to survival. The other part is drilling its way toward a cliff. The fight is no longer about the science. The science is settled. The fight is about what we choose to do when the science tells us something we don't want to hear. When the numbers show that the way we have always lived is no longer possible. Phoenix, a city named for a mythical bird that rises from the ashes, is now testing its own foundational legend. It has engineered a modern oasis in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, an act of pure defiance against nature. But the water that fueled that defiance is finite. It was never limitless. It never was. The final question is the one that the 2026 court rulings left hanging in the dry desert air. In the defining conflict of the 21st century, the collision between infinite economic ambition and finite natural resources, which one will give way first? The bulldozers are running. The